Okay, we're ready to begin, I think. My name is Joe Murray from Afri, and we're delighted to be back here again for airing Erris 3. I think, can that be heard, yeah? This is the third in the series. I suppose when we started off, we intended to be maybe a once-off. It emerged, I think, out of a conversation between Donal O'Kelly and Richie, and we found airing Erris to be a very useful way of communicating messages that otherwise are very difficult to get out there. So it's the idea of creating our own media, and I suppose allowing the community here to be heard and to tell the story of the oppression really that you have suffered for the last 13, 14 years. So it's great to be back. We've had an impressive lineup of speakers in the past, as we have today, but I'll let Donal O'Kelly introduce the panel. I suppose just what I wanted to do was, we have two pictures here of two great men, unfortunately both of whom died in very close together, Dermot Healy and Jerry Conlon. And Jerry Conlon, we had invited Jerry to be here today, and he was very interested in being here. He spoke at an event that we had in Trinity in November in solidarity with Chelsea Manning. And at that meeting, after that meeting, I spoke to him about Erris. He was very interested in expressing his solidarity with the community. And then we had a meeting to decide who we'd have on the panel, and Donal suggested inviting Jerry. And I rang Jerry up to invite him, and he seemed to have just got the news that he had cancer. So he was very upset, and he said that he was very ill. He said to say a prayer for me and light a candle. So I want to light a candle today for Jerry and for Dermot, two great men who are no longer with us. So their spirit will be with us during the proceedings today. So we'll just do that, and we'll start then formally. So somebody has matches. I give them back, I think.
Joe.
Dermot Healy was also a great supporter of the community down here opposing the Shell Corrib gas project, and many of us here will remember the night he came here in, I think it was 2008, maybe 2009, to Glenamoy Hall, and he recited some poetry along with his childhood friend Peter Galligan, and that night Peter Galligan dropped dead in Glenamoy Hall just before the concert ended, and died actually in Dermot Healy's arms. And now Dermot Healy himself has left us. One of the poems he recited that night, I remembered it well, was called Rogue Wave, and it was about a fisherman standing on rocks at the seashore being taken away by a rogue wave. Well, Peter Galligan was taken by a rogue wave that night in Glenamoy Hall, and now Dermot Healy has been taken by a rogue wave as well. He did, any time I ever asked Dermot to contribute to an event in support of the communities down here in Erris, he always said yes. And he read in at least 4 or 5 concerts in support of Shell to Sea, in support of Afri, in support of Public Kilcummin. Jerry Conlon, one of the things he said during the speech he gave in Trinity last November was, he said, if there'd been a whistleblower in the British police in the 1970s as courageous as Chelsea Manning, that he and his father, the Birmingham Six, Judith Ward and many others would not have suffered as they did for something they didn't do. So it's very appropriate, I think, that we commemorate both Jerry Conlon and Dermot Healy here today. Thanks. The panel we've got here, as you can see, we have Denis Halliday, Gemma O'Doherty, Margaretta Darcy, Bernard McCabe and Willie Carduff, who'll all speak. We're aiming to finish at 3:30, so that means that each speaker will speak for more or less 15 minutes, and then we will have a half hour at the end for contributions and questions from the floor. So I'll introduce each of the speakers individually before they speak. But to start off, I'm going to read out Afri's statement calling for an independent inquiry into the policing of the Corrib gas project. In light of ongoing controversies concerning lack of accountability of the Gardaí and serious shortcomings on the part of the Garda Síochána Ombudsman Commission, Afri, supported by the undersigned, wishes to draw renewed attention to serious concerns around the policing of the Corrib gas project. Local residents have exhausted all available means of redress, including reports to GSOC, the Minister for Justice and the Garda Commissioner, without receiving satisfactory responses. Therefore, we now call for an independent and comprehensive inquiry into all aspects of the policing of the Corrib gas project to seek redress and accountability in relation to abuses which are, sadly, ongoing. These concerns include, for example, the verbal and physical abuse of Willie Carduff by Gardaí as he took part in a peaceful protest in Glengad on April 22nd and 23rd, 2009. This was followed by an attack by a group of men in dark clothes with their faces covered. During this attack, Mr. Carduff was struck on the head by a blunt, leather-covered object and then beaten until he lost consciousness. Mr. Carduff was removed to hospital and suffered serious pain and distress for many weeks afterwards. This attack occurred while Gardaí were in close proximity and no satisfactory investigation into the attack has ever taken place. There are concerns also about the sinking of Pat O'Donnell's boat, the Iona Isle, which was boarded by masked men in June 2009. Pat O'Donnell, recipient of a State Bravery Award in 2013, and his crewman Martin O'Donnell were attacked and held down while the Iona Isle was holed and sunk under cover of darkness. Some hours later, men fitting the description of those who boarded the boat were reported to have been picked up in Killala Harbour by a transit vehicle used by the Shell Corrib gas project. Both Mr. O'Donnell and his crewman were later admitted to Castlebar General Hospital. A further cause for concern relates to an incident on 11th of June 2007 where the Garda superintendent recklessly forced a digger through a group of peaceful protesters at McGrath's Pier. This was reported to GSOC and, after many reminders, the complainant was notified on 30th of November 2009 that the matter had been referred to the Garda Commissioner and that the complaint was upheld as a breach of discipline. This preliminary finding was made against a named superintendent, the officer in charge of the district. After many more queries, the complainant was finally notified on 26th of April 2010 that in spite of the recommendations and findings of the GSOC in the matter, the Commissioner decided that no breach of discipline, quote, may be disclosed, unquote. The reply to the complainant from the chairperson of GSOC clearly illustrates the limitations of GSOC's role. Quote, it is important to note that the Act does not ascribe to the Commission a role whereby it can make a finding against a member of the Garda Síochána or the Garda Síochána as an organisation, unquote. It is clear from this that it is not within GSOC's power to make a finding against a member of an Garda Síochána. Ultimately, therefore, it is the Gardaí which decides whether a finding is made against themselves. It will also be noted that it took almost 3 years for the complainant to finally receive this highly unsatisfactory outcome. At the end of the day, despite the fact that GSOC found that a breach of discipline had occurred, no action was ever taken to hold the Garda in question to account. In April 2011, a tape emerged concerning Gardaí involved in the policing of the Corrib gas project. These Gardaí, unaware that a camera which they had confiscated was still recording, were taped laughing at their threats to rape and in one case deport 2 female protesters whom they had just arrested and who were being escorted in a separate car back to the police station. This behaviour has serious implications for victims of sexual crime who would be expected to report such crimes to the Gardaí. The women released the recording in the public interest to highlight the culture of policing of the Corrib gas project. As a result, these women were undermined and let down by the Gardaí, who leaked their details to the media, by GSOC, who falsely stated that they were not cooperating with the investigation, and by Minister for Justice Alan Shatter, who claimed that some people were intent on exploiting the incident. Worryingly, GSOC published an interim report in July 2011 which cast doubts on the veracity of the recording, most notably by suggesting that the women had themselves shouted rape during the protest and by referring to another unsubstantiated rumour that the recording had been tampered with. To date, no Garda has been disciplined in relation to this incident. In August last year, the Observer newspaper reported that €35,000 worth of alcohol was delivered to Belmullet Garda Station in December 2007 on behalf of Shell. In common with the other issues referred to here, this was never adequately investigated or explained. Without holding such an investigation, the impression remains of an unhealthy relationship between the Gardaí and Shell, raising serious questions about the ability of the Gardaí to be independent and impartial. In 2008, GSOC sought permission from the Minister for Justice, the late Brian Lenihan, to conduct a practice, policy and procedure review of the policing of the Corrib gas project. This request was denied. Despite the recommendations of many, including frontline defenders in its report on policing on the issue, this review has never taken place. Such a review was also a recommendation of the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights, Margaret Sekagwa, following a visit by her to Ireland in 2012. It is now past time for this situation to be rectified. It is clear from the issues listed here and from many other incidents over the years that attempts to make Gardaí accountable for their actions in policing the Corrib gas project have failed. It is in this context that we call for an urgent and comprehensive independent inquiry. That's supported by Archbishop Desmond Tutu, Denis Halliday, Ed Vulliamy, Andy Storey, Donald O'Kelly, Joe Murray, Bernard McCabe and Nuala Kelly. And I'll now play for you a statement from Archbishop Desmond Tutu.
I support Afri's call for an independent inquiry into the policing of the Shell project in the west of Ireland because the statement highlights many disturbing incidents such as the attack on local farmer Willie Corrib, about whom I previously expressed concern, and the sinking of a local fisherman's boat. It is very important that communities should have confidence in their police, especially a community which feels itself under siege since the arrival of Shell. It is important that the police should not only be fair and impartial, but be seen to be fair and impartial. It is in this context, in order to begin the process of rebuilding confidence, that I support the Afri call for the Irish government to establish an independent, comprehensive inquiry into the policing of the Shell project in Mayo.
Assistant Secretary General from 1994 to 98. As part of his work with the UN, he served in Iran in 1964. Over the next 30 years, he served in New York, Malaysia, Singapore, Brunei, Indonesia, Samoa and the South Pacific, and the former Indochina countries when stationed briefly in Bangkok, Thailand. In mid-1994, Secretary General Boutros Ghali appointed Halliday Head of Human Resources Management for the Global United Nations. In mid-1997, Halliday was appointed by Kofi Annan as head of the UN Humanitarian Oil for Food programme in Baghdad when Iraq was subject to sanctions imposed by the Security Council. Since resigning in 1998, in protest at the genocidal nature of these sanctions, Halliday has served as a visiting professor at Swarthmore College, Pennsylvania, a lecturer for Trinity College, Dublin, and as an international speaker and activist. In 2000, he was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. In 2003, he received the UK Gandhi International Peace Award in London. In mid-2010, Halliday was imprisoned briefly by Israel after they hijacked the MV Rachel Corrie en route to Gaza with humanitarian supplies. Denis Halliday. It'll pick you up, Denis.
It will?
Yes,
Good.
and Denis will.
Friends, it's great to be back here in Mayo.
in this part of Mayo in particular. Donal, thank you very much for your introduction. Can you hear me? Yeah. I'm feeling that I'm out of my depth here. Policing is not something that I've been sort of intimately involved with, but I'll do my best. And my conclusion is actually broader than the issue that we've seen here. And Donal has just given us some of the horrors and the experience in this part of Mayo, which we're horribly familiar with and we've seen again and again. But I think it's a countrywide issue. And I'd like to end on that note. But before doing that, and given the fact, as Donal has just implied, I've been out of this country since 1962, coming back every now and then, of course, thanks to Joe, being attached to Afri and enjoying that experience. But the international situation is, I know better than I know my own country nowadays, I suppose, and though I'm trying to catch up. And I just thought I'd give you some idea of what my experience has been overseas and then come back to the issue of Ireland itself. Because I've spent my life defending Ireland overseas, and we can be defended despite some of the policing concerns we all have, whether it's Irish peacekeeping or whatever role we're playing, or Frank Aiken is still remembered warmly in New York for his, when he was chairman of the president of the General Assembly. You know, this morning I just got a message from a friend of mine in the States. Dr. Rafiel Dafir, he's an American Iraqi oncologist, got 26 years in jail in the States and still is locked up because he gave money for, Willie, nice to see you, didn't see you before, because he gave money to Iraqi children through Jordan. 26 years, and he's been in solitary confinement in Indiana, now moved a little closer to home. He's now back in solitary confinement, I learned this morning, because he's been caught praying. RTE this morning then gave us a little story about what's happening in Israel. First of all, 3 innocent kids, Israelis, were murdered. Then there's retaliation, Palestinians being killed. And now there's another issue, and the Israeli police have been caught on video beating up some chap that turns out to be an American, so naturally it got attention. Had it just been another Palestinian he was beating up on, we would never have heard a word, because of course they beat up on the Palestinians every day. And in fact, hundreds of Palestinian kids have lost their lives in recent years. So I'm not going to talk about the situation here, because all of you here know more than I do, and other speakers may want to address it. And Donal's already given us, I think, a great deal. I think we need a change in Irish policing on a broader basis, for citizens, of course, for ourselves, for good government throughout Ireland, and our much challenged Garda, who need a lot of attention. They need to be enhanced within and in terms of their service to the rest of us. And their role in serving the country, and their discipline and their neglect of human rights in occasions, and their management or mismanagement and independence needs to be looked at and enhanced. And there is a story, there is a line in the paper today that it's amazing, but one bad Garda can destroy the reputation of the whole force. Well, you can reverse that. There are stories about lots of good Garda who do good things. And there's a tale of a German woman who just lost her child here, and she came here and found that her experience with the Garda was extraordinarily kind and gentle and warm. So there are 2 sides to this story, and I'm not telling you anything new. But I just think we need to look at ourselves. But if you look at the rest of the world, I mean, I spent years in Kenya. I was a volunteer in those days, and Kenya came out of the Mau Mau period, and the British are now acknowledging, perhaps, that they killed over 100,000 Mau Mau without any application of justice. And Kenya today, I think, reflects that sort of violence, and the interaction between tribes now has become very dangerous. The Kikuyu left in place, of course, by the British. So we see an action in Kenya which is justified today under the rubric of terrorism. That's something we do not want to use in this country, but maybe some of you are going to tell us we're in fact already there. In Iran, I arrived in Iran as a brand new UN official, and I got a letter from Amnesty International. Would I be good enough to monitor, i.e. spy, on SAVAK? SAVAK was the police set up by the Shah, trained by the CIA to monitor the things that were going on in Iran at that time. A very brutal system of policing, to say the least. In New York, I remember getting to New York, and one of the first days I walked down 2nd Avenue, I found 2 bodies lying on outside a shoe shop, I believe. They'd just been shot dead by the New York cops. that sort of violence really hits you when you come from Dublin or you come from Ireland, where we're not really familiar with that sort of violence. In 1968, you'll remember the Democratic Convention in Chicago, where the cops ran amok and brutalized a large number of protesters protesting against, presumably, must have been the Vietnam War. Again, police brutality in the States is shocking. It's often racist. Black friends of mine who have children, or teenage boys in particular, live in fear that they'll go out and never come back because they're so vulnerable today to being shot dead by the United States police, federal and or state. And of course, the people like Dafir who are in jail getting this appalling maltreatment it's just become so common over there. I also worked in places like Brunei, Singapore, and Malaysia, where again, in Brunei, it's religious police. In Singapore, it's very intensive, very controlling state police, efficient, rigid, and dangerous, I would say. Malaysia, it's a bit more laid back, but they have problems with racial minorities, and they've been struggling since independence in the 60s to have 3 ethnic racial groups working and living together successfully. In the case of Indonesia, the largest Islamic state, again, the police failed to provide protection for migrants, protection for slave labor and for sweatshops. Again, it's a thing that perhaps we're not into, but we also need to be careful. In Samoa, the police force were marginalized by customary laws. They run a feudal system there. The constitution was secondary to the feudal inheritance of the Samoan system. In Thailand, I think many perhaps are familiar, again, it's a police force that is absolutely ruthless when it comes to protests. People get shot, violence takes place, and it's become a way of policing, which again is no model for our own country. Of course, I ended up in Iraq, as Donald has said, where the corruption, the political motivation, and all the other things that are wrong with Iraq today, it's so bad, frankly, I hardly recognize it. But it was much better, believe me, under Saddam Hussein. And now al-Maliki is using Shia power and police power and his own power to turn the Abu Ghraib back into the sort of pornographic torture center that the Americans set up when they were in occupation for, what, 10 years or so. Again, there's no model there of any interest, I think, to us in this country. You can talk about Burma and the violence there. I think some of you are familiar with the Rohingyas. This is an Islamic minority trapped on the border with Bangladesh, who have gotten no support whatsoever from government. In fact, they're harassed and persecuted. The San Suu Kyi has not lifted a finger in their need, being a politician, of course, which he always was, and planning to, I guess, become more powerful as time goes by. Israel, I won't go into that. You're all familiar, I think, with what's happening there, the tragedies that the Palestinians face every day. And also, of course, 25% of the Israeli population are Arabs. They also have a difficult time. Now, I've been visited and spoken in places like Tunisia and Egypt and China and Germany and India and so on. Everywhere you go, you find some aspect of policing which is extremely unattractive, where executions are still carried out, something we gave up here a long time ago. So in many ways, we're not as bad, you might say. One looks at the 6 counties, or of course I should say Northern Ireland, and the British leftover up there still seems to be part of the game. And let's see how next week goes when the 12th of July comes up and how well they can manage that situation. Now, in our own Ireland, I mean, the expert is here. Lorna Siggins has written this extraordinary book. I'm sure we've all got a copy or read it, on the situation here in Mayo. And, but there are other examples. Donald's given us some already. As I was speaking to a friend of mine who spoke about the 1976 train robbery, where 3 members, possibly, I think, are linked to perhaps the IRA, were framed and took several years to find justice. In 2002, there was the Reclaim the Streets activity in Dublin. Again, our police force seems to have lost control of themselves, or discipline broke down, and innocent people were hurt. And we now have the the ongoing whistleblower investigation, which is, I think, critical to the future. And we've seen some new developments with Roma and other people, that intolerance is unfortunately alive and well. It's alarming, I think, to see Garda weak on issues like protecting civilians, like our guests or immigrants or refugees. They need their human rights protected, and that is our job as a state and our own Garda. We do have a tragic history, clearly, of failing to protect innocent people in terms of their human rights, whether it's the famine period or thereafter, the civil war, single mothers, children, immigrants, the Roma themselves, the traveling people. So we have some huge issues here that need to be addressed. Now the question is, where does the problem lie? It seems to me greatly it's government and government policy. And we can't, in my view, hold the Garda responsible for implementing government policy. So government policy, the system of justice, the Attorney General, now we have a brilliant new Minister of Justice, I must say, in my view. That seems to me where a great deal of the solution or change lies. We have to look at the church, our own society, education, the other issues that we are partly responsible for, and our culture, which has this colonial leftover of we don't trust decision making, we don't trust the police force, given our background in this country of the colonial past. And I think the Garda reflect some of these failures, and our failures in leadership, failures in government policy, and that needs to be changed. And if public trust has been severely damaged, it's really not surprising given what's been going on in the years past. Now I'd like to suggest that we do an investigation, but not only as Tutu was talking about, Mayo, but a broader investigation. I think the whole system needs to be looked at. And I would suggest this should be a domestic Irish citizen examination of the Irish institution on Garda. This is something that has to be done in a very open way. We don't need any government members, nor former ministers of justice, please, or no members of the Oireachtas need to be involved. We need gender balance. We need not just Dublin, but the whole country involved in this process. We need young people involved. We do not need the judiciary or solicitors, but we need, nor retired judges, thank you very much, but we need a really representative panel of the users, we the citizens, the civilians, who pay the bill and need protection and need guidance from our Garda, that Garda we trust and have confidence in. Now I'm suggesting we should encourage the thought of setting up a presidential commission or a presidential investigation under our President Michael D. Higgins, because I think he has a position, he has a history, and he has a dream of ethics. And ethics, I think, is what we need here. You can visualize terms of reference which would examine policing expectations that we all hold as civilians, both Irish and EU and international laws need to be brought into our, properly placed in the Irish context. We need to look at the end user needs, the rights, that's us, the Irish experience so far in the past and in the future, citizens' responsibilities, that's a key part of that, and policies I've mentioned, and a proper management of the Garda system, their independence, how they relate to government, how they relate to us, their training, development, education, absolutely critical and seems to me much missing. Training in social issues, training in gender issues, training in all of the areas where they now find themselves, from drug lords to mass murder to children's rights. It's a tough job, and we're not giving them the numbers, we don't give them the resources, they don't have even the latest cars fast enough to catch the bad guys, so to speak. So there's real work to be done. And I would hope a commission of this type, at that sort of high level, would look at government policy on policing, look at other models, maybe Scandinavian, maybe New Zealand, look at the expectations that we citizens have, the needs, our responsibilities as citizens, because that is critical, our compliance to international standards, EU standards, our tolerance for social injustice, that needs to be corrected, and our resistance to Garda functions, legitimate though they may be, and the training that would change all those sort of needs. So to end, I think we need to create a better, a well-selected, well-trained, equipped and effective Garda. You can't run a modern state without that sort of capacity. We need men and women who are secure in the laws under which they function, that they're confident where their terms of reference end and begin, and that they will find a government policy that's consistent with our Constitution and our modern needs. And that with this sort of examination and work and commission and recommendations, we may be able to create a new arm of the state, or a better arm of the state, that both protects and serves we, the civilians, of this imperfect yet extraordinary country. There's real work to be done, and that's just one way, perhaps, of looking at it. Thank you.